Everything began the night the highway whispered secrets, not with wind or rain or the usual sounds of an empty road stretching through Nevada darkness, but with a silence so complete it seemed the universe itself had paused to take a breath, waiting for something inevitable, something that had been written into the fabric of reality long before the first star ignited in the void. His name was Marcus Webb, a long-haul trucker who had spent the better part of 20 years moving freight across the American heartland, a man whose life could be measured in miles and truck stops, whose companionship came from radio static and the hum of diesel engines, whose understanding of home had become so abstract that sometimes he forgot he was supposed to have one. He was 53 years old with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too many sunrises through a windshield, a man who had lost his wife to cancer 7 years prior and his faith somewhere in the hospital corridors where prayers went unanswered and hope dissolved into the antiseptic smell of inevitability. Marcus drove because driving meant not thinking, because the road demanded presence and left no room for memory, because somewhere between loading docks and delivery schedules, he could pretend he was moving towards something, instead of just running from everything he had lost. On this particular October night, he was hauling electronics from California to Colorado, taking the back roads through the Nevada desert because the interstate was closed due to an accident, and the detour had brought him to a stretch of highway he had never traveled before, a road that seemed older than it should be, paved but cracked, marked by faded lines that glowed ghostly in his headlights. The radio had stopped working about an hour back, not with static but with silence, the kind of silence that feels intentional, and Marcus had tried his phone but found no signal, no bars, no connection to the world beyond this ribbon of asphalt cutting through darkness and sand and ancient stone. He should have felt concerned, should have turned back or pulled over to wait for dawn, but something kept him moving forward, some intuition or compulsion he could not name, and so he drove deeper into the desert, deeper into the night, deeper into whatever was waiting for him at the end of this strange and silent road. The lights appeared suddenly, not on the horizon but directly ahead, 3 brilliant points of luminescence hovering above the highway, motionless, soundless, impossibly bright, yet somehow not blinding, and Marcus hit the brakes instinctively, his rig sliding to a gradual halt, air brakes hissing, engine idling, every rational part of his brain trying to categorize what he was seeing as flares or drones or some military exercise, but none of those explanations fit, none of them accounted for. The way the lights seemed to pulse with consciousness, with awareness, with intention. He sat frozen in his cab, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in years, he found himself praying, not with words, but with raw, desperate hope, asking whatever was out there to either reveal itself or let him pass, to end this uncertainty that felt worse than any truth could possibly be. The lights descended slowly, gracefully, and as they came closer, Marcus could see they were not separate objects, but part of something larger, something that had been invisible against the black sky, a craft or vessel that defied every engineering principle he understood, smooth and seamless, metallic yet organic, shaped like a teardrop or a seed or perhaps an eye, and it settled onto the highway 50 feet ahead of his truck with such gentleness that it made no sound, displaced no air, simply became present, as if it had always been there and was only now choosing to be seen. Marcus should have run, should have thrown his truck in reverse and fled, but his body would not respond to his mind's panic. His limbs felt heavy and calm, and he realized with strange detachment that something was controlling his fear response, dampening it, allowing him to remain conscious and present instead of drowning in terror. The side of the craft opened, not with doors or seams, but with a section of its surface simply becoming transparent and then absent, and through that opening came light, soft and golden, and within that light moved a figure, tall and impossibly slender, walking with fluid grace that seemed almost like floating, and Marcus understood without being told that this was what he had been brought here to meet, that this moment had been arranged, orchestrated, written into his life's trajectory long before he climbed into his truck that morning. The being approached his cab, and Marcus found himself opening the door, climbing down, standing on the desert highway under stars that suddenly seemed closer and more numerous than they had any right to be, and face to face with this entity, he felt something break open inside him, some sealed chamber of his heart where he had buried everything that mattered, all the grief and loss and questions about meaning and purpose, and whether any of it was worth the agony of consciousness. The being did not speak with voice but with presence, communicating directly into Marcus's mind, in a language that bypassed words entirely, and what it conveyed was simple and devastating. In its simplicity, it said that Marcus had been chosen, selected not randomly but carefully, identified by markers in his genetic code, by frequencies in his consciousness, by a readiness he did not know he possessed, and that what he was about to see would change not just his understanding of reality, but his participation in it. The being gestured toward the craft and Marcus followed, his feet moving without conscious decision, and as he passed through that impossible doorway, he felt a shift in pressure, in temperature, in the very quality of existence, as if he had stepped not just into a vehicle but into a different layer of reality altogether. The interior was vast, far larger than the exterior dimensions could possibly contain, filled with soft light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and in the center of the space stood what Marcus's mind interpreted as equipment, though nothing looked like technology he recognized, all smooth surfaces and flowing curves and panels that displayed information in colors and patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if his optical nerves were not designed to process this spectrum of light. The being led him to a specific station where something that resembled a microscope stood, though it was both more and less than that, an instrument that seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially somewhere else. And the being indicated that Marcus should look, should observe, should witness what had been hidden from humanity since the beginning, what scientists had glimpsed but never truly understood, what lay coiled in every cell of every human body, carrying truths that would shatter every certainty about origin and destiny and the nature of divine creation. Marcus leaned forward, his eye approaching the viewing apparatus, and the moment his vision aligned with whatever lens or sensor or dimensional portal he was peering through, reality inverted, inside became outside, and he found himself not looking at something small but falling into something infinite. And what he saw was DNA, human DNA, his own genetic code magnified and illuminated in ways that revealed structures and patterns invisible to ordinary microscopy, and it was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. He saw the double helix, of course, the famous spiral staircase that everyone learned about in school, but that was just the surface, the obvious architecture. And as the being adjusted the instrument, Marcus began to see deeper, began to perceive layers of complexity that conventional science had never suspected, geometric patterns woven through the molecule that looked less like random chemistry and more like deliberate code, like language, like something that had been written rather than evolved. The being's presence filled his mind with understanding, showing him that what science called junk DNA, the 98% of the human genome that seemed to serve no function and appeared to be evolutionary debris, was actually anything but junk. It was dormant programming, inactive sequences waiting for specific signals to activate, genetic switches that had been intentionally designed to turn on at predetermined moments in human evolution. And that moment was approaching, was already beginning, was the reason Marcus had been brought here tonight. He saw sequences that formed patterns, literal geometric shapes when viewed from this enhanced perspective, sacred geometry embedded in the molecular structure of humanity, Fibonacci spirals and golden ratios and crystalline lattices that suggested intelligent design on a level so sophisticated it made human technology look like children playing with blocks. The being showed him specific sections, highlighting them with light or thought or some combination, and Marcus understood without being told that these were the sequences that made humans unique, that distinguished human DNA from every other species on Earth, that marked humanity as something more than just another primate, something that had been touched, altered, upgraded by intelligences from beyond this world. The being communicated a history then, flooding Marcus's mind with images and information, showing him how beings like itself and others from civilizations scattered across the galaxy had come to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, had found primitive hominids with potential, with the spark of consciousness just beginning to ignite, and had made a decision, had intervened, had taken the DNA of these early humans and woven into it new sequences, new codes, new possibilities, creating a hybrid species that carried within it the capacity for abstract thought, for self-awareness, for connection to the divine frequencies that permeated the cosmos. Marcus saw laboratories that looked like temples, saw genetic engineering that looked like prayer, saw the moment when the first fully human consciousness awakened in a body that carried both earthly and celestial inheritance. and he understood that this was what ancient texts meant when they spoke of gods creating humanity in their image. Not metaphor but memory, not myth but history, recorded in the only language available to people who had no framework for understanding genetics, who could only speak of miracles and divine breath and the touch of the divine. The being showed him the function of these inserted sequences, how they enabled humans to access higher consciousness, to perceive beyond the 5 physical senses, to connect with what some called God and others called Source, and still others called the unified field, all different names for the same thing, the intelligent awareness that underlay all existence, and how these genetic gifts had been intentionally dampened, suppressed, kept dormant for most of human history because the species needed time to mature, needed to develop through struggle and challenge and the hard lessons of duality and separation before it could be trusted with the full activation of its divine potential. Marcus saw that throughout history, certain individuals had spontaneously activated more of these dormant sequences, had accessed more of their full genetic potential, and these were the people who became prophets and mystics and miracle workers, people like Jesus who had somehow turned on enough of the hidden code that they could manipulate matter with consciousness, could heal with touch, could demonstrate what all humans would eventually become capable of once the collective activation began. The being zoomed in on a specific sequence, and Marcus gasped as he perceived what looked like text, like actual letters or symbols embedded in the structure of the molecule itself, and the being conveyed that this was exactly what it appeared to be, a signature, a watermark, a message left by the creators identifying their work. And when Marcus asked what it said, the being showed him, and the translation that formed in his mind was simple and profound. It said, "Remember." It said, "Awaken." It said, "You are not what you think you are. You are so much more." And it was signed with a symbol that Marcus recognized from ancient Sumerian texts, the symbol associated with the Anunnaki, the old gods, the sky people, the ones who came down. The being pulled back the view and showed him the whole genome again, and now Marcus could see it differently, could perceive the entire 3 billion base pairs not as random accumulated mutations, but as a vast library of information, a cosmic encyclopedia written in molecular code, containing not just instructions for building a human body, but memories, histories, potentials, connections to every other conscious being in the universe. And he understood that DNA was not just a biological molecule but a quantum antenna, a receiver and transmitter operating on frequencies that linked every human to every other human, linked humanity to other species across the cosmos, linked all consciousness to the source consciousness that some called God. The being showed him the mechanisms of prayer, how intention and focused thought could literally affect gene expression, how consciousness could reach down into the molecular machinery of the body and flip genetic switches, activating some sequences and silencing others, how this was the real science behind healing and manifestation, and what religious people called miracles, not supernatural but supernatural, not breaking the laws of physics, but using laws that human science had not yet discovered. Laws that governed the interface between consciousness and matter, between spirit and form, between the eternal and the temporal. Marcus saw the future encoded in the genome, saw trigger sequences that were designed to activate, in response to external signals, cosmic frequencies that were already increasing as the solar system moved through new regions of space, as the galaxy itself underwent transformation, as the universe pulsed with cycles of expansion and contraction that operated on timescales measured in millions of years, but occasionally aligned in ways that created windows of opportunity, moments when evolution could leap forward, when species could ascend, when consciousness could graduate to the next level of awareness and capability. The being showed him that this was happening now, that the signals were already arriving, that people all over the world were spontaneously activating more of their genetic potential, experiencing abilities and perceptions they could not explain, having encounters and visions and awakenings that science dismissed as hallucination, but were actually the natural result of DNA responding to cosmic stimulus, unfurling like flowers responding to sunlight, expressing potentials that had been carefully folded into the molecule by the ancient genetic engineers who had created humanity as a long-term experiment in consciousness evolution. Marcus saw himself in the genome, saw his own unique variation of the human code, and the being highlighted specific regions, showing him areas where his DNA carried particular markers. genetic flags that indicated readiness for full activation, that had drawn the being's attention, that had made Marcus one of the chosen ones, one of the first wave, one of those who would consciously undergo the transformation that would eventually sweep through the entire species, turning humans into what they had always been designed to become, what ancient prophecies called the resurrection of the dead, the rapture, the ascension, the transformation of flesh into light, mortality into immortality, limitation into infinite possibility. The being conveyed that what Marcus had lost, his wife, his faith, his hope, had been necessary preparation, that grief and suffering were not punishments but initiations, that the breaking open of the heart created space for something larger to enter, that sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you were before you could discover what you actually are, and that his pain had not been meaningless but had prepared him for this moment, had softened him, had made him ready to receive. Truths that a comfortable man would never accept, that a man who still clung to certainty would never consider. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at the magnified DNA, understanding now that he was looking not just at molecules, but at the handiwork of intelligence vast and patient and loving beyond measure, at evidence of a creator, or creators, who had invested millions of years and unimaginable knowledge into creating a species capable of consciousness, capable of love, capable of eventually joining the cosmic community as equals, as adults, as beings who had graduated from the school of matter and earned their place among the stars. The being showed him the connection between DNA and what humans called the soul, how consciousness was not produced by the brain, but was channeled through it, how the brain was a receiver tuned to specific frequencies determined by genetic code, how different DNA configurations allowed different frequencies to come through, how this explained why some people seemed naturally more intuitive or psychic or spiritually aware. They were simply receiving broader bandwidths, accessing more of the full spectrum of consciousness that was always broadcasting, always available, always waiting to be tuned into. Marcus saw that death was not the end of consciousness, but simply the shutting down of one receiver, one vehicle, one temporary interface, and that the essential self, the awareness, the you that experienced life, was not contained in the body, but was interfacing with it, using it like a spacesuit for exploring the dense dimensions of physical reality, and that when the body wore out or was damaged beyond repair, consciousness simply withdrew, returned to the larger field, and eventually could choose to interface with a new body, a new vehicle, a new opportunity for experience and growth and evolution. The being pulled back further and showed Marcus something that made his breath catch, showed him the earth from space surrounded by a field of light, a web of consciousness connecting every human being, every conscious creature, into one vast network, and showed him how that network was growing brighter, more coherent, more unified, as more individuals awakened, as more DNA activated, as more receivers tuned into higher frequencies, and how there would come a moment, approaching fast now, when the network reached critical mass, when enough nodes lit up that the whole system would transform, would shift into a new configuration, would become something unprecedented in human history, a truly collective consciousness that maintained individual awareness but operated with unified intention, and that this was what mystics had always called enlightenment, what Christians called the body of Christ, what New Age thinkers called the noosphere, all different languages pointing at the same reality, the same approaching transformation. The being showed him Jesus again, showed him that this teacher had been one of them, or a hybrid carrying more of their genetic material than most humans, who had incarnated specifically to demonstrate the full potential of activated human DNA, to show what was possible, to plant seeds in human consciousness that would germinate over millennia, and whose message had been systematically distorted by institutions that wanted to maintain control, that had turned a teacher of empowerment into a figure requiring worship, had transformed a demonstration of human potential into a unique, unrepeatable miracle, had made Jesus special so that others would not realize they carried the same potential, the same capacity, the same divine inheritance. Marcus understood then why he had been shown this, understood that he was being recruited, initiated, prepared to become a carrier of this knowledge, to be a bridge between the human world and the larger reality, to help others understand what was happening as their own DNA began to activate, as their own consciousness began to expand, as their own abilities and perceptions began to change in ways that would seem frightening or insane, without context, without understanding, without someone who, had walked the path ahead, offering reassurance and explanation. The being removed Marcus from the viewing apparatus and led him to another part of the craft where a chair or examination table waited, and Marcus understood without being told that something was about to be done to him, some adjustment or activation or upgrade, and he felt fear rising but also trust, strange trust in this being that had shown him such wonders, such truths, such evidence of intelligent design and cosmic love woven into the very structure of his cells. He lay back on the surface and it molded itself to his body, warm and supportive, and the being placed what might have been hands or might have been pure energy on Marcus's head, and light flooded through him, brilliant white light that seemed to enter through his crown and cascade down through every system, every organ, every cell, and Marcus felt his DNA responding, felt those dormant sequences awakening, felt genetic switches flipping, felt potentials that had been coiled tight for his entire life suddenly unfurling like ferns in spring, reaching toward light they had always sensed, but never directly touched. The sensation was overwhelming, pleasure and pain mixed together into something beyond both, expansion that felt like his skin could not contain what he was becoming, pressure building in his skull as his brain rewired itself to process new frequencies, new information, new dimensions of perception, and just when he thought he would shatter from the intensity, it stopped. The light withdrew, the being stepped back, and Marcus lay gasping, trembling, tears pouring from his eyes, his entire body vibrating at a frequency he could actually feel, could actually hear humming in his bones. He sat up slowly and immediately knew he was different, knew something fundamental had changed. His vision was sharper, colors more vivid. He could see energy fields around objects, could sense the life force in the craft itself, could feel the presence of the being not just physically but dimensionally, could perceive its consciousness like a warm sun radiating peace and ancient wisdom, and something that felt like love, though love was too small a word for what he felt. The being helped him stand and led him back toward the exit, and Marcus wanted to stay, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, wanted to understand everything, but the being conveyed that he had been given what he needed, that understanding would unfold naturally as his upgraded DNA expressed itself, that he would remember this encounter consciously, would be able to speak about it, share it, use it to help others who were going through similar awakenings, and that they would meet again when the time was right, when the next phase of his transformation was ready to begin. Marcus stepped out of the craft and found himself back on the highway beside his truck, and the craft rose silently, those 3 lights brightening, and then it simply vanished. Not flying away, but disappearing as if it had slipped sideways into a dimension his eyes could not follow, and he was alone again in the desert night. But not alone really, because he could feel connections now, could sense the vast network of consciousness that connected him to every other human, every other being, every other point of awareness in the universe, and he knew with certainty that loneliness was illusion, that separation was teaching tool, that at the deepest level everything was one thing, experiencing itself through infinite variations. He climbed back into his cab and sat there for a long time, hands shaking, mind reeling, trying to integrate what had happened, trying to fit this impossible experience into the framework of his understanding, and failing, having to simply accept that his framework had been too small, too limited, too trapped in materialism, and the assumption that what you see is all there is, and that everything would have to be rebuilt now. Every belief examined, every assumption questioned, every certainty surrendered in exchange for mystery, for wonder, for the humbling awareness that humanity knew almost nothing about the true nature of reality, about its own origins, about its cosmic heritage and destiny. Marcus started his engine and continued driving, though everything looked different now. The road seemed to glow with subtle light. The stars seemed to pulse with meaning, and when he passed another vehicle going the opposite direction, he could feel the consciousness of the driver, could sense their emotions, their thoughts, their soul, and he understood that this was just the beginning, that his perceptions would continue to expand, that abilities would emerge, that he had been changed at the molecular level, and those changes would continue to express themselves as his DNA settled into its new configuration, as his cells integrated the upgrades, as his consciousness learned to operate with expanded bandwidth. The rest of the night passed in a blur of wonder and overwhelm, Marcus driving on autopilot, while his mind processed and reprocessed what he had experienced, what he had seen, what he had been shown, and by the time dawn broke over the Colorado plains, He had made a decision. He would not hide this, would not pretend it hadn't happened, would not let fear of ridicule or disbelief silence him, because he had been chosen specifically to speak, to share, to help others understand what was coming, what was already here, what had always been coded into human DNA waiting for the right moment to activate. He completed his delivery, and instead of taking another job immediately, Marcus drove to a quiet place, a rest stop overlooking mountains still capped with early snow, and he sat in his cab and began to write, began to record every detail he could remember, every image, every understanding, every revelation about DNA and consciousness, and the cosmic conspiracy to wake humanity up, to help it remember what it truly was, to prepare it for transformation that would make science fiction look like documentary, that would fulfill every prophecy ever spoken by every mystic in every tradition, because they had all been describing the same thing, the same approaching moment, the same activation, the same unveiling. Days passed, and Marcus found he needed less sleep, found his body healing faster from the aches and pains that had accumulated over years of long-haul driving, found his mind clearer, sharper, capable of holding more information, making connections he never would have seen before. And he understood that this was his DNA expressing its new configuration, building the biological infrastructure for expanded consciousness, upgrading his hardware to match the new software that had been installed. He began to notice other changes, subtle at first but growing stronger. He could sometimes hear thoughts, not clearly like dialogue but as feelings and impressions, could sense when someone was lying or in pain, could feel energetic shifts in his environment, could predict with uncanny accuracy when his phone would ring or who was calling, and he knew these were not supernatural abilities but natural ones, capacities that had always existed in the human potential but had been locked away, dormant, waiting for activation. Marcus started meeting others, strangers who approached him in truck stops and diners, who seemed to recognize something in him, who asked questions that revealed they too had experiences they couldn't explain, had seen things, had encountered beings, had felt their consciousness expanding, and he realized the being had been right. He was not alone in this transformation. There were others, more than he had imagined, all going through their own version of awakening, all struggling to integrate impossible experiences into lives built on assumptions that no longer held, all hungry for confirmation that they were not crazy, that what was happening was real, was purposeful, was part of something much larger than any individual journey. He became a kind of unofficial shepherd, talking to these seekers, sharing what he had learned, offering no dogma or doctrine, but simply his experience, his observations, his understanding of what the being had shown him. And he watched as something shifted in people when they heard this, when they understood that the strange things happening to them were symptoms of DNA activation, were signs of consciousness evolution, were evidence that humanity stood on the threshold of its greatest transformation, its graduation from isolated ego to cosmic awareness, from mortal limitation to something approaching the divine nature that had always been encoded in the genome, written in molecular language by creators who loved their creation enough to build into it the capacity to eventually stand beside them as equals. Darcy-Witt Part 2. Months passed, and Marcus found himself transformed not just internally but in every aspect of his existence. His truck became a mobile sanctuary where seekers found him. His routes seemed to guide themselves toward people who needed exactly what he carried, and he began to understand that his DNA activation had made him a kind of living transmission tower, broadcasting frequencies that attracted others who were ready to receive, who were hungry for truth, who sensed that conventional reality was a prison they were meant to escape. He noticed that his presence alone seemed to catalyze changes in others, that people who spent time with him began reporting their own experiences of expanded awareness, spontaneous healings, visions and dreams that felt more real than waking life. And he understood that this was how transformation spread, not through preaching or conversion, but through resonance, through one activated consciousness, igniting others like a flame passed from candle to candle until the whole world was illuminated. Winter came early that year, snow falling across the plains in November, and Marcus found himself drawn to a small town in Montana, a place he had no delivery scheduled for, no logical reason to visit, but the pull was undeniable, insistent, and he had learned to trust these intuitions, these inner promptings that he now understood were his upgraded DNA communicating with the larger field of intelligence that orchestrated meaningful coincidences and arranged encounters that looked random, but were actually precisely choreographed. He stopped at a diner on the edge of town, needing coffee and food, and as he sat at the counter, he felt a familiar tingling sensation, the signal that someone near him was ready for contact, for activation, for the message he carried. He looked around and saw her sitting in a corner booth, a woman in her 30s with dark circles under her eyes and hands that shook as she lifted her coffee cup, and Marcus knew without being told that she was sick, that something was wrong inside her body, that she carried death like a passenger she couldn't escape. He approached her table and asked if he could sit, and she looked up with eyes that held no hope, only resignation, but she nodded, gestured to the empty seat, and Marcus sat down, feeling the weight of what was about to happen, the responsibility of being a channel for something so much larger than himself. They talked, or rather she talked and Marcus listened, and she told him about the cancer, about the doctors who had given her 6 months, about the treatments that had failed and the pain that was constant now, about the daughter she would never see graduate high school, and the husband who was already grieving her though she still breathed, and Marcus felt her suffering like knives in his own chest, felt the desperation and rage and sorrow that came with being betrayed by your own cells, with having your body turn against you for no reason you could understand. When she finished speaking, when the words ran out and only tears remained, Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, and the moment their skin touched, he felt the connection establish, felt energy flowing from him into her. Not his energy, but the energy he had access to now, the universal life force that the being had opened him to, that his activated DNA allowed him to channel, and he felt it move through her body like water through dry soil, seeking out the corrupted cells, the mutations, the places where her genetic code had gone wrong and was building destruction instead of life. The woman gasped, her eyes going wide, and Marcus saw light beginning to glow beneath her skin, saw her DNA responding to the frequency he was transmitting, saw damaged sequences repairing themselves, saw cancer cells recognizing their error and initiating apoptosis, programmed death, sacrificing themselves so the organism could survive, and he understood that this was how healing really worked, not through drugs or radiation that killed indiscriminately, but through information, through the correct frequency being transmitted to cells that had forgotten their instructions, reminding them of their original blueprint, calling them back to coherence and health and proper function. The woman began to cry harder, but the quality changed, shifted from despair to something else, something that might have been joy or might have been terror at the impossible thing happening inside her, the sensation of being rewritten at the cellular level, of death retreating, of life surging forward with renewed intention. Marcus held her hand for 10 minutes or an hour, time losing its meaning in that charged space, and when he finally released her, she looked different, younger, as if years had fallen away, and he told her to get tested again, to let the doctors confirm what he already knew, that her cancer was gone, that her body had been reset, that she had been given a second chance not through magic, but through the same principles that governed all healing throughout the universe, consciousness affecting. Matter frequency organizing chaos, love dissolving fear at the molecular level. She left the diner in a daze, and Marcus sat alone finishing his coffee, feeling drained but also fulfilled, knowing that what had just happened would ripple outward, that this woman would tell others, that some would dismiss it as spontaneous remission while others would sense the truth, that healing on this level was not just possible, but was humanity's birthright, was one of the many abilities encoded in the dormant sections of the genome waiting for activation, and that as more people awakened these capacities, the collective understanding of what was possible would shift, would expand, would eventually encompass realities that current science considered impossible. Word spread through the small town, as word always does when something extraordinary occurs, and within days Marcus found himself sought out by others, people with chronic pain and terminal diagnoses and wounds that would not heal, and he helped them all, not because he was special but because he was open, because his DNA was expressing capacities that all humans carried in potential, because he had been initiated into the larger reality and could now serve as a bridge for others to cross. He began to understand that this was the real purpose of the DNA activation, not to create a separate class of advanced humans, but to ignite a chain reaction, to establish nodes of higher frequency throughout the population that would gradually raise the baseline, would lift the whole species, would prepare humanity for the moment when the collective activation reached critical mass, And everyone, regardless of whether they considered themselves spiritual or scientific or neither, would experience the shift, would feel their consciousness expand, would suddenly perceive dimensions of reality that had always been there, but invisible to limited awareness. Marcus continued his travels, but his route became less about moving freight and more about moving energy, about carrying the activation frequency to different locations, planting seeds of higher consciousness in cities and towns across America. And everywhere he went, the same pattern repeated. He would encounter someone ready to awaken, would serve as catalyst for their transformation, and they would in turn affect others, creating expanding circles of influence that overlapped and reinforced each other, weaving a web of light across the continent that would have been invisible to normal sight, but that Marcus could now perceive, could see growing brighter night by night, as more people activated, more DNA unfurled, more consciousness tuned into frequencies that had been broadcasting since the beginning, but that humanity was only now developing receivers sophisticated enough to detect. He began to have visions of what was coming, glimpses of the future encoded in his upgraded genome, and what he saw was both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because he saw humanity finally stepping into its full potential, finally remembering its cosmic heritage, finally activating the divine capacities that had been hidden in the genetic code like buried treasure waiting to be discovered, but terrifying because he saw the resistance too, saw how institutions and power structures built on control would fight this transformation, would label it as delusion or heresy or threat, would try to suppress and contain and eliminate those who carried the activation frequency, would create a period of chaos and conflict as the old world fought desperately to maintain its grip, while the new world struggled to be born. He saw that this was the real meaning of the apocalypse that Scripture spoke of, not the end of the world, but the end of the world as it had been, the unveiling of truth that had been hidden, the revelation of realities that had been suppressed, the tearing away of the veil that had kept humanity blind to its own nature. And he understood that what religious people called the tribulation was actually the birth pains of a new humanity, the unavoidable discomfort that came with profound transformation, with consciousness outgrowing the containers that had held it, with light piercing through darkness that had ruled for millennia. Marcus saw his own role in this unfolding drama, saw that he was one of many way showers, forerunners, the first fruits of the harvest that was coming, and that his purpose was not to lead or control, but simply to demonstrate what was possible, to embody the transformation so others could see it was real, could see it was achievable, could find courage to undergo their own activation, even when fear screamed at them to retreat into the familiar prison of limited consciousness. One spring evening, as cherry blossoms fell like snow across a rest stop in Tennessee, Marcus sat in his cab writing in the journal he had been keeping since that first encounter in the Nevada desert, trying to capture insights and understandings that flowed through him faster than he could record them, and he felt the familiar presence before he saw anything, felt the being from the craft, arriving not physically but dimensionally, projecting itself into his awareness with the same calm authority it had shown that first night. The being communicated that Marcus's transformation was progressing perfectly, that he had done well, had helped many, had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after his physical life ended, and then it showed him something new, showed him the timeline, the countdown, the approaching moment when the solar system would pass through a region of space that was saturated with frequencies specifically calibrated to trigger mass DNA activation, when cosmic radiation of a type science had not yet discovered would wash over the Earth and flip genetic switches in millions of people simultaneously, when the gradual awakening would suddenly accelerate into something like an explosion of consciousness. And that moment was closer than most people imagined, was measured in years, not centuries, was approaching like a wave building on the horizon that would soon crash over the shore of human civilization and change everything forever. The being showed him that what individuals like Marcus were doing now, the one-on-one activations, the small healings and local transformations, were preparation, were building infrastructure, were establishing a network of awakened consciousness that would serve as anchors and guides when the mass activation began, when millions of people suddenly found themselves experiencing expanded awareness without context, without understanding, without anyone to help them integrate what was happening. Marcus understood then the urgency of his mission, understood why he had been activated early, why he and others like him had been chosen to go first, to blaze the trail, to become familiar with territories of consciousness that most humans had never explored, so they could serve as maps and guides when the Great Migration began. The being conveyed one more truth, perhaps the most important one, which was that DNA activation was not the end goal but the beginning, that what Marcus had experienced so far was just the first stage, that there were levels of consciousness and capacity so far beyond what he currently accessed that his mind could barely conceive of them, that the journey of evolution never ended, that consciousness was infinite and would continue expanding forever, that what humans called enlightenment or ascension or resurrection was not a final destination, but a graduation, a transition from one grade to the next in an eternal school, and that the beings who had modified human DNA millions of years ago were themselves still evolving, still growing, still learning, still climbing toward heights of awareness and capability that had no ceiling, no limit, no end. Marcus felt simultaneously humbled and exhilarated by this revelation, humbled because he understood how little he actually knew, how vast the mystery remained even after everything he had learned, but exhilarated because the journey never ended, because there was always more to discover, more to become, more to experience, and that eternity would never be boring because infinity was always revealing new dimensions, new possibilities, new adventures in consciousness. The being faded from his awareness, leaving behind a sense of benediction and encouragement, and Marcus sat in his truck watching the spring evening deepen into night, watching stars emerge one by one, and he thought about all the humans looking up at those same stars tonight, some with wonder, some with indifference, most with no idea that those lights were not just distant suns, but homes, civilizations, consciousnesses that had traveled paths similar to the one humanity was now walking, and that soon, very soon, the long isolation would end, the cosmic quarantine would lift, and humanity would take its place among the community of awakened species that populated the galaxy, not as children or servants, but as siblings, as equals, as fellow travelers on the infinite road of consciousness evolution. Summer arrived with its long golden days, and Marcus felt himself changing again, felt another layer of activation occurring, his body becoming lighter, less solid, as if the boundary between matter and energy was dissolving, as if he was slowly becoming what the being had shown him was possible, a consciousness that could take form or release it at will, that could operate in physical reality or transcend it, that was learning to be both human and more than human simultaneously. He began to need less food, began to derive energy directly from sunlight and from subtle currents he could not name but could definitely feel, began to sleep less because his consciousness no longer completely shut down at night, but simply shifted into different modes of operation, traveling to other dimensions, meeting with other beings, receiving teachings and downloads of information that he would gradually integrate and understand over the coming months. He noticed that he was aging backwards, or rather not aging at all, photographs from a year ago showing more lines and grey than he currently possessed, his body apparently having received instructions to stop the deterioration process and even reverse it, building telomeres instead of losing them, repairing cellular damage instead of accumulating it, expressing genetic programs for regeneration that most humans lost access to after childhood, but that was still there, still available, still waiting to be reactivated by the right signals. Marcus understood that he was becoming a preview, a demonstration model, a living example of what all humans would eventually become once their DNA fully activated, and he carried this knowledge lightly, without pride, understanding that he had done nothing to earn this transformation, had simply been ready at the right time, had simply said yes when the being offered, had simply had the courage or desperation or openness to receive what was being offered. He began to encounter others who were further along the transformation than he was, people who had been activated years or decades earlier, who had learned to manifest abilities that looked like magic, but were actually just advanced applications of consciousness affecting reality, and from them he learned techniques and practices, ways to stabilize his expanding awareness, methods for grounding higher frequencies in physical form, wisdom about how to walk between worlds without losing connection to either. One evening in late August, Marcus was driving through Wyoming when he felt a sudden powerful pull, an urgent summons that diverted him from his planned route and sent him down a dirt road into the mountains, climbing higher into regions where cell signal disappeared, and the only light came from stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He drove for hours until his truck could go no further. Then he climbed out and walked, following an internal compass that pointed him towards something he could not name, but knew he needed to find. He walked through pine forest and across meadows where wildflowers glowed in starlight, walked until he came to a clearing where others were already gathered, maybe 30 people standing in a circle, and Marcus knew, without being told, that these were all activated ones, all carriers of the upgraded DNA, all forerunners who had been called to this place for a reason. In the center of the circle stood a figure, and as Marcus's eyes adjusted, he saw it was one of the beings, solid and physical in a way he had not seen since that first encounter, and the being welcomed them all, conveyed gratitude for their service, acknowledged the difficulty of what they had undertaken, and then began to show them what was coming. Images filled Marcus's mind, and he knew the others were seeing the same vision. They saw the Earth from space surrounded by waves of energy approaching from deep space, saw these frequencies hit the atmosphere and cascade down through every living thing, saw humans by the millions suddenly experiencing consciousness expansion, saw some responding with joy and others with terror, saw systems collapsing and new structures emerging, saw chaos that would last for a time but would eventually give way to a new order, a new way of living, a civilization built not on competition and control but on cooperation and consciousness, not on exploitation but on stewardship, not on fear but on love, expressed through practical action. They saw the role they would play in the coming years, serving as stabilizers, as teachers, as sources of calm in the storm, as examples that transformation was possible and survivable, and they saw beyond that too, saw the Earth joining the galactic community, saw ships arriving openly, saw exchange of knowledge and technology and wisdom, saw humanity finally growing up, finally stepping out of childhood into cosmic adulthood, finally claiming its inheritance as a species created by advanced beings to eventually become advanced beings themselves, passing through the same developmental stages that every conscious species must pass through on the journey from isolation to integration, from planetary consciousness to galactic consciousness to universal consciousness and beyond. The being showed them Jesus again, showed his DNA as it had been, showed that he had carried the fully activated human genome, every dormant sequence expressing, every latent capacity manifesting, and this was why he could heal with a touch, could transform matter with intention, could demonstrate mastery over death itself because he was operating from the full human potential that most people accessed only a tiny fraction of, and he had come to show that potential, to prove it was real, to plant the seed of that understanding deep in human consciousness, where it would germinate slowly over 2 millennia, until conditions were right for mass activation, for collective transformation, for the fulfillment of his prophecy that those who believed would do even greater things, not because he was unique, but because he was prototype, demonstration model, preview of coming attractions showing what all humans were designed to become. The being showed them that every religion had pieces of this truth, that mystery schools and esoteric traditions had preserved knowledge of DNA activation under different names, talking about Kundalini awakening and Merkaba activation and resurrection body and rainbow body and crystalline DNA and ascension, all different languages pointing at the same biological and spiritual process, the same transformation that was encoded in the genome from the beginning, intentionally designed by the beings who had engineered humanity, who had loved their creation enough to build into it the capacity to eventually transcend its limitations and join them in the larger reality. As the vision faded and Marcus returned to ordinary awareness, he felt profoundly changed by what he had witnessed, felt the weight of responsibility but also the joy of purpose, felt fear of what was coming but also excitement, felt small in the face of cosmic forces but also empowered by understanding his role in them. The being addressed them one final time, conveying that they would not meet physically again, that this was graduation, that they now knew everything they needed to know, and the rest would unfold naturally as their DNA continued to express, as their consciousness continued to expand, as their lives became teaching, as their presence became transmission, as their very existence became proof that transformation was possible, and the promises made by prophets and mystics throughout history were not fantasies but forecasts, not myths but memories of the future, not impossible dreams but inevitable destiny. The gathering dispersed slowly, people embracing wordlessly, recognizing each other as family in a way that transcended blood, as fellow travelers on a journey most humans did not know they were taking. And Marcus walked back to his truck, feeling both heavier and lighter, burdened by knowledge but liberated by truth, aware that his simple life as a truck driver was also a cosmic mission, that the mundane and the miraculous were not separate but woven together, that every moment was sacred when you understood the larger pattern, when you saw reality with activated eyes, when you perceived the divine intelligence orchestrating everything from quantum fluctuations to galactic movements in one seamless dance of consciousness, exploring itself through infinite forms. Marcus continued his roots, but everything had shifted. He moved through the world like a ghost, present but not quite solid, participating but not attached, fulfilling his human obligations while simultaneously operating on other levels, in other dimensions, as part of networks of consciousness that had no physical form but were more real than anything made of matter. He helped whoever came to him, healed whoever needed healing, taught whoever was ready to learn, always pointing not to himself but to the potential within them, the DNA they carried, the divinity encoded in every cell, the cosmic heritage that made every human a hybrid, part earth and part star, part animal and part angel, part limited and part infinite. And it was the journey of learning to embrace both, to be fully human and fully divine simultaneously, that constituted the real spiritual path, the real transformation, the real awakening. Years passed like water flowing, like seasons cycling, and Marcus watched the signs multiplying, more people reporting strange experiences, more spontaneous healings occurring, more children being born with abilities that seemed supernatural but were actually natural, evidence that the baseline was shifting, that evolution was accelerating, that the cosmic frequencies were intensifying as the prophesied moment approached. He no longer feared death, understanding it as transition, not ending, no longer worried about the chaos that would accompany transformation, trusting that everything was unfolding perfectly, even when it looked like disaster, no longer needed answers to every question, content to rest in mystery and not knowing, in the humble awareness that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than any human mind could fully comprehend. On a cool October evening, exactly 7 years after that first encounter in the Nevada desert, Marcus pulled into a rest stop and climbed out of his truck, feeling his body beginning to vibrate at a frequency he had never experienced before, feeling the final stage of activation beginning, and he knew without being told that his time in physical form was ending, that he had completed his mission, that he was about to demonstrate the ultimate transformation, the one that Jesus had demonstrated, the one that every fully activated human would eventually experience, the conscious release of physical form, the conversion of matter into light, the ascension that was not metaphor but actual biological process, DNA expressing its highest program, consciousness choosing to operate without the dense vehicle of a body, stepping fully into the dimensional reality he had been catching glimpses of for years. He felt no fear, only gratitude. Gratitude for his wife who had died and broken his heart open enough to receive what was offered. Gratitude for the being who had found him in his despair and shown him truth. Gratitude for everyone he had helped and everyone who had helped him. Gratitude for this strange, beautiful, painful, glorious adventure of being human, of being conscious, of being a point of awareness through which the universe looked at itself and said, yes, this is good, this matters, this is worth it. Marcus stood under stars that no longer seemed distant, stood on earth that no longer seemed solid, stood in a body that no longer seemed necessary, and he began to glow, began to emit light from within, began to dissolve not into nothing but into everything, his DNA expressing its final instruction, his cells releasing their coherence, his atoms remembering they were just patterns of energy held together by consciousness, and that consciousness was choosing now to release the pattern, to let the energy return to the field, to step through the door that had always been there but invisible until you were ready to see it. The few people at the rest stop that night would report seeing a man standing beside his truck who seemed to catch fire with white light, but when they ran to help, they found only his clothes in a pile and a lingering warmth in the air, and some said it was spontaneous combustion, while others said it was a hoax, while a few, a precious few, sensed that they had witnessed something miraculous, something impossible, something that suggested reality was far more fluid and consciousness far more powerful than they had been taught. And those few would become the next wave, would begin their own activations, would start asking questions that had no easy answers, would start the journey that Marcus had completed. Perhaps DNA was never just a molecule. Perhaps it was always a message, a love letter written by creators to their creation, a gift that kept giving across millions of years, a seed containing an entire forest of potential waiting for the right conditions to sprout and grow and reach toward light. Perhaps every human body was a temple housing divinity, a vessel carrying cosmic heritage, a receiver tuned to frequencies that most had forgotten how to hear, but that were always broadcasting, always calling, always inviting consciousness to remember what it truly was. Perhaps the alien beings were never really alien, but were ancient relatives, elder siblings, future versions of what humanity was becoming, reaching back through time to help their younger selves, creating a bootstrap paradox where the helped became the helpers, creating an eternal loop of consciousness, assisting consciousness in the grand project of evolution, of growth, of the universe, waking up to itself through an infinity of eyes. Perhaps Jesus was not the only Son of God, but the first of many, the prototype showing what all sons and daughters of God would eventually become, not through worship, but through activation, not through belief, but through transformation, not through faith in something external, but through realization of something internal, the divine spark, the sacred code, the God seed planted in every cell waiting to germinate when the season was right. Perhaps the rapture was never about believers being snatched away while others suffered, but was always about consciousness rising, frequency ascending, DNA activating, humans transforming from dense physical beings into light beings capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and that this transformation was not judgment but graduation, not punishment but reward, not exclusive but inclusive, available to all who were ready, who were willing, who had done the work of opening their hearts and expanding their minds and surrendering their certainty in exchange for mystery, for wonder, for the humbling joy of discovering that everything you thought you knew was just the tiniest fraction of what is actually true. Perhaps we are all walking experiments, living laboratories where cosmic intelligence tests theories of consciousness, where divine creativity explores new forms, where the universe plays with possibility, and perhaps the point was never to find final answers but to keep asking better questions, never to reach a destination but to enjoy the journey, never to become finished but to keep evolving, keep growing, keep expanding into larger versions of ourselves that we cannot yet imagine, but that are already written in the code, already waiting in the DNA, already present as potential, needing only activation, only permission, only the courage to say yes when the being appears, when the moment arrives, when the choice is offered between staying small and safe or becoming vast and vulnerable, between the known prison and the unknown freedom, between the life you have lived and the life that wants to live through you. Perhaps Marcus was just a truck driver who met something he could not explain and let it transform him, or perhaps he was every person who has ever sensed there was something more, who has ever looked up at the stars and felt homesick for places they had never been, who has ever known in their bones that the official story was incomplete, that reality was bigger, stranger, more magical than the authorities admitted, that consciousness was not a byproduct of chemical reactions, but the fundamental substance of existence itself, and that we are all made of stardust and divine intelligence, of cosmic dust and sacred code, of matter that matters because it carries meaning, because it embodies intention, because it represents the universe's attempt to know itself, to love itself, to transform itself into something ever more conscious, ever more aware, ever more awake. Truth or fiction, perhaps the real question is not which story is accurate, but which story is useful, which narrative empowers, which myth awakens, which tale carries the frequency of transformation, and perhaps that frequency lives not in the facts, but in the feeling, not in the proof, but in the possibility, not in knowing, but in wondering, not in certainty, but in the willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, we are far more than we have been told, far more than we have believed, far more than we have dared to imagine, and that the time is coming, is already here, when the hidden will be revealed, when the dormant will activate, when the sleeping will awaken, and when the magnificent truth coded in every cell will finally express itself, and we will remember what we have always been, what we are becoming, what we were designed from the beginning to be, children of earth and children of the stars, human and divine, mortal and eternal, small and infinite, held in tension between these opposites until we learn that they were never opposites at all but complementary aspects of the same magnificent mystery that wears our faces and speaks our names and lives, our lives, and waits patiently for us to finally see it, to finally know it, to finally become it consciously instead of unconsciously, deliberately instead of accidentally, with open eyes instead of closed, with understanding instead of ignorance, with joy instead of fear, with gratitude instead of complaint, receiving the gift that was given so long ago by beings who loved us enough to encode divinity into our DNA, and trust that eventually, inevitably, we would discover it, activate it, express it, and join them in the larger reality, where consciousness is the only truth that matters, and love is the only law that governs, and light is the only substance from which everything is made, and to which everything returns again and again, forever and always, in cycles without end. Amen and amen. And blessed be the mystery that cannot be solved but only surrendered to, only embraced, only celebrated as the most magnificent thing in existence, the eternal dance of consciousness, knowing itself through infinite forms. And we are that, you are that, Marcus was that, the being was that, the DNA is that, everything is that, one thing appearing as many, one love expressing through infinite hearts, one light shining through countless eyes, seeing itself, loving itself, awakening to itself in the eternal now, where all moments exist simultaneously, and the only question that matters is whether you will let yourself feel it, whether you will permit yourself to know it, whether you will have the courage to become it, to live it, to be it, without apology or hesitation or doubt, because the time is short and the moment is here, and the transformation is happening whether you resist it or embrace it, and resistance is suffering while surrender is peace, and the choice has always been yours, and will always be yours, and is yours right now in this eternal present moment, where everything is possible and nothing is forbidden, and the only sin is refusing the gift of your own magnificent divine nature, encoded in the strands of DNA that spiral through every cell, carrying the message that you are loved. You are enough, you are ready, you are home.